And if you need a quarterly, Barry's coming down the aisle now and has them in his hand. We're studying this quarter the book of Mark. And basically the purpose of Mark's account, gospel account, is recorded in the opening verse. Mark 1:1 says, "The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God." That's what Mark did with his letter, with his epistle. He pointed everyone who read his epistle toward Jesus. He led his audience to see what Jesus was, who he was, what he did. Turn to, before we start today's lesson though, I want us to look back at some verses that we kind of skipped over between Christopher's lessons last week about the parable and today. Because, well, you'll see why when we get to it. Turn to Mark chapter 4. I want to read verses 35 through 41. And my purpose for reading this is it kind of sets us up to where we are today, where we're starting. But more than that, it shows us Jesus' power. And that's part of what Mark does in his epistle. He points over and over to all that Jesus does and can do. Mark chapter 4, verse 35. "On that day when evening came, he said to them, 'Let us go over to the other side.'" Now, to remind you where we were last week, they were on the east side of the Sea of Galilee on the bank. Jesus was teaching a huge crowd of people that had gathered there. And he taught them through parables. Last week we talked about the parable of the sower, and then there were a couple of others after that. So he spent all day long teaching them and talking to these people and doing things for them. And now he's trying to get away. He's trying to rest, just like we would want to. So he says, "Let us go over to the other side." Verse 36, "Leaving the crowd, they took him along with them in the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with him. And there arose a fierce gale of wind, and the waves were breaking over the boat so much that the boat was already filling up. Jesus himself was in the stern, asleep on the cushion, and they woke him and said to him, 'Teacher, do you not care that we're perishing?'" These men were scared to death. They were fearing for their lives. So they woke up the teacher. "And he got up, and he rebuked the wind, and he said to the sea, 'Hush, be still.' And the wind died down, and it became perfectly calm. And he said to them, 'Why are you afraid? Do you have no faith?' They became very much afraid and said to one another, 'Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?'" Now imagine if you were the apostles, or if you were some of the disciples riding along in the other boat. They're in a little boat, probably what we would think of as a skiff today. But the waves are crashing over, the wind's up, they can't see the bank. We went, when I was a kid, my dad and another man and I went fishing. Dad had the bright idea that we would set up some trot lines and go run them. And we got on Jennings Creek, which is not a large creek, but it was so foggy that we couldn't see the bank. And the creek couldn't have been from bank to bank much wider than this room. But still, the fog was that thick, and it was a scary feeling not knowing exactly where we were till we got a little closer and could see the bank. I can imagine being out on the lake, the Sea of Galilee in this case, in the wind and the waves crashing over. They were scared for their lives. So they woke Jesus up, and Jesus had the power to still the winds.
Yeah, they have uncovered, archaeologists have a first century fishing boat which can hold as much as a dozen people in them. So they're not huge, but they, it's enough for these 12 men to be on. If you can imagine a boat that way with guys with no life jackets.
It'd be scary.
20 feet deep water, yeah.
This morning, now we see here, by reading these, we see he's got power over nature. This morning we're going to see he has power over demons. Which leads me to my first question of the morning. What's your understanding of demons? what do you think a demon is? And the reason I ask is I guess after studying this lesson 58 years later, I may have changed my mind a little bit about what a demon was. What do you think it is? If
possession of another entity within a person. I mean, it's not like that your spirit so much is turned bad, but another spirit has come in and taken over.
Taking control. If you've ever picked up Caroline from preschool on a Wednesday afternoon, and she's not had a nap during the day, I would show you what I think a demon is. Okay, let me ask you something else. When do you think demons were here? Or are here? Do you think demons are here today? I just told you about Caroline, not counting Caroline. The way the author explains it, the author of the commentary anyway explains it, we don't read much of demons or unclean spirits in the Old Testament a couple of times. We read about Saul. Remember, he was taken over, go back to Barry's term, taken over by an unclean spirit, a troubled spirit, I think some versions call it, and tried pinning David to the wall with his spear, just couldn't be pleased. Again, I go back to Caroline on Wednesday afternoon. Nothing you can do, please him, that kind of thing. But we read about lots of different mentions of demons, and unclean spirits is another term for basically the same thing. In the New Testament, especially here in Mark, there's 4 different instances where Mark tells the story of Jesus casting out evil spirits. Mark 1, 21 through 28, Mark 5, 1 through 20, which is our text today, Mark 7, 24 through 30, Mark 9, 14 through 29. I tell you, I've changed my mind, I think, a little bit about what I thought demons were, because if you had asked me last week, Johnny, what's a demon? I would have said, well, it's an assistant to the devil, the opposite of an angel. And maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But if it is, why didn't we read about them? Why didn't we read about them when Paul was preaching? Later, why didn't we read about Timothy running across demons? I don't know. Maybe. Lots of maybe. These are unanswerable questions. But maybe Jesus, or maybe God allowed the devil to have these assistants running around while Jesus was here, just to show Jesus' strength. There's power. Better word, power. I don't know. But we don't. We know for a fact we don't know much about demons, first off, and we don't read about them later. And all kidding aside about Caroline, I don't think they're floating around today. Now, one of the things the author pointed out was a lot of things that people thought were demons then, and may have been demons, I don't know, but were sick. People were sick. Things that we now, because we're so smart, things we now know that were diseases that may be uncurable, or we call it depression today, things like that. Maybe people blamed on demons back then, but it was just the normal chemical reactions we go through, we as people.
That belief continued on up through really relatively recent history, witches.
I started to say you could probably go to the 1600s and talk about witches and,
Same kind of idea.
that kind of thing.
I kind of thought that, similar to what you're saying, the people centuries and centuries ago were very superstitious, way more so than today. They had their own system of gods and everything, the Romans and the Greeks and everything. And of course, I'm sure they had the physical and mental problems that we have to deal with partially today. But I always thought that during Jesus' life, during his ministry, that, like you said, God's not going to allow us to be tempted above what we can stand, but these demons were allowed to exist in presence of the earth so that Jesus could prove to these superstitious people that these definitely had demons and Jesus had the power over them. And they knew him. It wasn't like that they were a troubled spirit like I might have or something. I mean, these were they knew Christ because they recognized him. And even when he knew they were going to throw him out, well, when one said, cast us into the swine, because that was a better death, I guess, than just being obliterated. I don't know, but
well, we're going to talk about that in a minute. Let's go take what Barry said. Mark 1:34. Mark talking about Jesus here again. Then he healed many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons. And he did not allow the demons to speak because they knew him. Elsewhere, he recorded the reaction of unclean spirits when encountered by Jesus. In other words, when they ran into Jesus, this is what they did. Mark 3:11. And the unclean spirits, whenever they saw him, fell down before him and cried out, saying, You are the Son of God. I'm going to read across this again in a minute, but I want to point it out right now while I'm thinking about it. Think about the irony of these demons, these unclean spirits. They recognized Jesus. They accepted that he was the Son of God. They knew he had this power. And yet you've got the 12 apostles and all these disciples following him around for 3 years. And even up until the day Jesus died, until he was gone, and really until the Holy Spirit came back and somehow helped them understand, I believe. They didn't understand Jesus' power. They didn't understand what he was saying to them. But the demons knew. We just read that. And when we read in a minute, I promise I'm going to get to the text in a minute. And when we get to the text, you're going to see the unclean spirit knew Jesus immediately, knew who he was, and was afraid of him, and worshiped him. Now, let's get to our text. Mark chapter 5, verses 1 through 20, or if you've got the quarterly, it's page 41. Verse 1, Then they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gadarenes. And when he had come out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit, who had been dwelling among the tombs, and no one could bind him, not even with chains. If we'd run across this man, we would have been scared to death. All of us have been to Nashville or other big cities and have run across homeless people who, when they spoke to you, you could tell they weren't all there. And you know how it is. You run between, man, I ought to try to help this guy, and I need to run just as quick as I can before he goes nuts. Well, that's what Jesus has run across here. Verse 4, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, and the chains had been pulled apart by him, and the shackles broken in pieces, neither could anyone tame him. Aiden J. Law is always talking about his superhero talent, whatever it is. Right now it's super cat speed. He talks so fast you can't understand him, but every now and then if you see him just dart down the aisle, that's what he's doing. He's showing me he's got super cat speed. Well, this guy had superhuman strength. He could bend chains and they wouldn't hold him. Verse 5, And always night and day he was in the mountains and in the tombs, crying out and cutting himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and worshipped him. Is this what you thought he would have done? The first thing I think you would think is this wild man would have attacked Jesus. But instead, when he saw him and realized who he was, he ran and worshipped him. And he cried out with a loud voice and he said, What have I to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I implore you by God that you do not torment me. He was afraid of Jesus. He knew the power immediately that he had. Verse 8, For he said to him, talking about Jesus, Jesus said to him, For he said to him, Come out of the man, unclean spirit. Then he asked him, so Jesus is asking the man, What is your name? And he answered and said, My name is Legion, for we are many. I want to point something out. I'm going to bring it up again in a minute, but go back to verse 7. I implore you by God that you do not torment me. Verse 9, my name is Legion, for we are many. Notice that, because we're going to come back to it. Also, we begged him earnestly that he would not send them out of the country. I don't understand that part. Now a large herd of swine was feeding there near the mountains. So all the demons begged him, saying, send us into the swine that we may enter them. And once Jesus gave them permission, then the unclean spirits went out and entered the swine. There were about 2,000. And the herd ran violently down the steep place into the sea and drowned in the sea. So those who fed the swine fled, and they told it in the city and in the country, and they went out to see what it was that had happened. Then they came to Jesus and saw the one who had been demon-possessed and had the legion sitting and clothed in his right mind, and they were afraid. You would have thought they would be happy. One of their countrymen had been saved. He'd been brought back to them. But instead it says, and they were afraid. Verse 16, and those who saw it told him how it happened to him, who had been demon-possessed, and about the swine. Then they began to plead with him to depart from their region. And when he got into the boat, he who had been demon-possessed begged him that he might be with him. However, Jesus did not permit him, but said to him, go home to your friends and tell them what great things the Lord has done for you, and how he had compassion on you. And he departed and began to proclaim in Decapolis all that Jesus had done for him, and all marveled. Jesus and his disciples went to the west side of the Sea of Galilee, apparently just to escape the crowds, to get away. We all know that pressure sometimes. This apparently was an area where Gentiles lived, because we read about the 2,000 swine. Remember that Jews did not eat pork. It was forbidden. There would have been no reason for pigs around a bunch of Jews. This area apparently was inhabited by Gentiles. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all three record this story. Now there's a little difference. Matthew talks about two people being kind of wild. But apparently Mark and Luke just center on the main focus, the one man, and what Jesus did for him. I've already said that all of us have been to big cities and have run into homeless people that might scare us because they act a little different. Really, you don't have to go to Nashville to do that. We've got homeless people here in Carthage. We've got people walking the streets that sometimes you wonder if they're all there. They're just a little bit different. But as soon as Jesus stepped out of the boat, this wild man approaches him. And Mark 5:2, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. You know how we are about, Barry mentioned being superstitious a few minutes ago. You know how we are a little bit about cemeteries anyway. It kind of puts us on edge. Well, here he is. This man lives in a cemetery and runs around with no clothes on, and already has the reputation of he can bend chains and they can't bind him, and he's not in jail. This was a man to be feared. On top of that, we're told he's so wild that he cut himself with stones. This was a scary man. But again, as soon as he sees Jesus, he comes running up to him, not to attack him, but to fall down and worship him. In verse 7, he confessed Jesus to be the Son of the Most High God. And I go back to how ironic it is that these demons, I don't know how to explain, because I've already told you I'm confused now about what a demon is, but these apparently beings that did serve the devil in some way, maybe they weren't devil assistants like I thought, but still they're not good creatures. They recognize that Jesus is the Son of God, and they recognize His power. When these people that Jesus is trying to teach for 3 years still question in their minds, who is this Jesus? And is He here to lead a physical army, and one of these days we're going to be assistants to the King of the world? They didn't quite get it yet. Now, I told you to notice, at one moment the devil appears to be one, and at another he appears to be many. Verse 9, I pointed out, he uses a singular pronoun. What have I to do with you? But then I think that was verse 18. But then he goes on down later in verse 9 and says, my name is Legion, for we are many. And then he casts these demons, these unclean spirits, into the swine. And he says there's 2,000 swine. I don't know if that means there's 2,000 demons. Legion was a word that the Roman army used to talk about what we would think of as a troop or a battalion or whatever that could run between 3,000 and 6,000 people. So the author points out maybe there were between 3,000 and 6,000 evil spirits inside this one man. Either way, we see that Jesus had power over them. Now, I told you I didn't understand this, but they pleaded with Jesus, don't send us out of the country. And my first thought, a long time thought, I guess, is they just wanted to spare themselves. They didn't want to leave here, wherever here is. They didn't want to leave the earth. But they had to realize, if they were thinking beings at all, if he casts us into the swine and we run down the hill into the water and kill the swine, we're gone anyway. We go back to wherever demons live, wherever they came from. So you may have a thought about that. I didn't understand that. I don't know why they cared where he sent them. Because either way, it looks like they were gone. The loss of the swine had to be a big financial loss for the people that owned them. If you'll forgive the personal story for a minute, I'm full of personal stories, but I can remember barely when I was a kid and we were living in Cookeville. Dad decided that he was going to buy some cows, and they're in this little electric wire fence lot in front of the house, probably a couple of acres. But he goes out one morning, and Mama was telling this story at Thanksgiving. Is the reason I remember the story. And she almost was in tears when she was telling Seth the story, because they had these 6 cows, and they got struck. They were laying under the tree or whatever. They got struck by lightning, and Dad goes out that morning, and all 6 of them are out there dead. Mama says they're laying on their backs with their feet up in the air like dogs. I don't think that's it, but still. For them, it was a big financial loss. And even today, this has been 40 years ago. Longer than that. It's been 50 years ago. And Mom was telling the story at Thanksgiving, and tears came to her eyes because it had to create a problem for them. They lost these 6 cows. It was a big investment for them then. I say all that to say it was a big investment for whoever owned these 2,000 swine. So they come over, and they're mad because Jesus has killed their pigs, apparently. They've got this big loss. And rather than see the strength of Jesus and the opportunity that was there, they're mad because they lost their swine. They don't care that a man's been healed. They're just worried about their pigs and the financial whatever to them. So in verse 15, it says they were afraid. Instead of honoring Jesus, they began to plead with him, in verse 17, to depart their region. They didn't care who he was. They didn't care what he could do. We want you to leave. Their reaction was opposite of the man who Jesus healed. Verse 18 says, and when he got into the boat, talking about Jesus gets in the boat. He who had been demon-possessed begged him that he might be with him. That's the reaction that I hope we would have. We see this man with all this power, with all this ability to do this, and we want to follow him. We want to go with him instead of asking him to leave the neighborhood. We don't want to run him off. We don't want to be with him. And that's what the man did. But Jesus, in all his wisdom, and I say all his wisdom because I think my reaction would have, if I'd been Jesus, I'd have said, sure, come on along. We're going to go about trying to do good. We need all the volunteers we can get. But instead, Jesus, in his wisdom, tells him to stay here. Verse 20, verse 19, he tells him, stay here. and to spread the word. Verse 20 tells us that the changed man followed Jesus' command. And that's the reason I wanted to bring that up, because it's important. He did what Jesus told him. He began to proclaim in Decapolis and all that Jesus had done for him, and all marveled. He spread the word. He had the courage. This is a man who had nothing. He lived unclothed, out in the wild, cut himself with stones. Yet he got over all that, and he went out and did what Jesus told him to do. He spread the word. The man who seemingly had nothing became a follower of Christ and apparently spread the good news. But those who seemingly lived comfortable, maybe a whole lot like our lives, what we would consider normal, they rejected Jesus and the opportunity that He gave them, that His being there gave them. It's a scary thought when you think about it. What would we have done had He come to Carthage, Tennessee, and thrown the evil spirits out of someone, and we'd witnessed it? What if it had been our swine we lost? You have to wonder. We would all do well to remember that no matter what sin or struggle that we face, Jesus is able to help us overcome each hurdle. You know, every time I teach a lesson in here, I want us to try to bring, I don't want us just to read the verses and study what happened then, look at history. I want us to try to take a lesson from it, to learn something from our time here. And I struggled a little bit about what it was we were supposed to learn here, but one of the things is this: Jesus has the power to do anything. If we have a problem that we just cannot beat, Jesus can help us beat it. He can help us cross that hurdle. Look, in Romans 7, verses 24 through 25, Paul said, "O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death?" And then he says, "I thank God that through Jesus Christ our Lord." We talk a lot, we throw around the thing that Paul said about he was the chief of sinners. But Paul was a man who, if he didn't murder, he at least facilitated murder. We're told, or we should not rank sins as one sin's worse than another. But I think it's human nature, maybe more than human nature, that we do that. It's just natural, and we think that one of the worst is murder. Well, Paul was guilty of that. He was the chief sinner. He actively recruited people. He actively arrested people that claimed to be Christian. He was a bad man at one time. But he turned it around, and that's what he's saying. I thank God through Jesus Christ our Lord. A second lesson, and this is one I think we all need to learn, is that we've got to be careful not to value our possessions more than individuals. You know, I talked to you a minute ago about the conflict I have when I run into a homeless person. Part of me is afraid of them. Part of me thinks, why don't you go get a job? Why can't you live a normal life? Why can't you, all the different things that go along with it? But then they're people too. Now, they may be people with a problem. There's something going on with them. But there's that conflict there. And it's something that we all need to do better at. Humans are valuable because they're created in God's image. Genesis 1:27. Matthew 16:26, if you want to get it out of the New Testament. For what profit is to a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? We all have souls. We all need help to some degree, some more than others. So we have to do better there, I guess, me especially. I appreciate your attention, appreciate you being here today. Anybody else have any more comments? That's all I have.